She thought she was just inheriting an old cabin, a forgotten place in the mountains, left behind by a man who never said much. But the moment Clara Whitmore stepped inside, she realized this wasn't just another inheritance story. Hidden beneath that quiet cabin, she uncovered something no one had ever spoken about. A secret room, old journals, and a life lesson story about kindness and legacy written in silence across generations. This wasn't about money. This was about a life lesson story about helping others and a promise someone had kept for decades. Before we begin, if you believe one act of kindness can change a life, hit subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Clara Whitmore had never liked the cold. Not the kind that slipped under your coat and settled into your bones, and certainly not the kind that followed you home. But that morning, she drove straight into it anyway. The snow had been falling for hours, thick, steady, like the sky had decided to forget the world beneath it. Her old SUV pushed forward through the winding mountain road, tires crunching against ice as the trees closed in on both sides. Tall pines, endless, silent. She hadn't said a word since leaving Portland, not to the radio, not to herself. Just the hum of the engine and the quiet weight of everything she hadn't dealt with in years. Her Uncle Walter was gone. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, not after her mother died, not after the distance settled in like something permanent. He had chosen this place, this isolated stretch of land in Ash Grove Ridge over family. Or at least, that's what Clara had always believed. And now, somehow, everything he left behind belonged to her. The house, the land, the silence. She told herself this was just a formality. Sign the papers, meet the lawyer, sell what could be sold, and leave before the weekend was over. But as the road narrowed and the snow grew heavier, Clara felt something shift deep in her chest. This didn't feel like a visit. It felt like being called back. By the time Clara saw the house, the light was already fading. Dusk in the mountains didn't arrive gently. It sank in all at once, turning the sky a deep bruised blue, swallowing the edges of everything. The cabin stood at the far end of a narrow path, half buried in snow. The roof dipped slightly under the weight of winter, and the wooden fence that lined the property leaned at odd angles, like it had simply grown tired of standing straight. A single porch light flickered, casting a weak glow across the untouched snow. For a long moment, Clara didn't get out of the car. She just sat there, hands resting on the wheel, watching her own breath fog the glass. This was it. This was the place her uncle had chosen over everything else, over family, over connection, over her. At least, that's what she had told herself for years. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Then silence took over, deep, heavy, almost unnatural. The kind of silence you don't just hear, but feel pressing in around you. Clara exhaled slowly and reached for the door handle. The cold hit her the second she stepped out, sharp, honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. It wrapped around her face, crept down her collar, bit at her fingers even through her gloves. "All right," she muttered under her breath, more to steady herself than anything else. The porch creaked beneath her boots as she climbed the steps. Every sound felt louder out here, the wood shifting, the wind brushing past the walls, the faint rattle of something loose somewhere in the distance. She pulled the key from her coat pocket. The lawyer had mailed it with no note, no explanation, just a single line in the email, "Mr. Whitmore left everything in your name." Everything. Clara stared at the key for a second longer than necessary, then slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, like it hadn't been turned in a long time. Then, with a stiff click, it gave way. The door opened slowly, groaning as if it were waking from a long sleep. The air inside was still dry, cold in a different way than outside, not sharp, but settled, like it had been sitting untouched for years. Clara stepped in, her boots echoing softly against the wooden floor. For a moment, she just stood there, letting her eyes adjust, letting the space reveal itself. The room was exactly what you'd expect, and yet, not quite. A wood stove sat in the corner, cold and empty. A couch draped in a faded blanket faced a stone hearth. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, jars, and small objects that didn't immediately make sense. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, but nothing felt abandoned. That was the strange part. It didn't feel like a place someone had left behind. It felt like a place that had been paused. Clara walked further in, brushing her fingers lightly across the back of a chair. The dust came away easily, but beneath it, the wood was solid, cared for. She moved into the kitchen. A kettle sat on the stove. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, still turned to a month from nearly 2 years ago. Several days were circled in faded ink, though she couldn't tell why. Next to it, a small note had been pinned. Her breath caught slightly as she stepped closer. The handwriting was unmistakable. Rough, steady, familiar in a way that made something tighten in her chest. Check the well before the freeze. That was it. No message, no goodbye, no explanation. Just a reminder, left behind like he expected someone to come back and read it. Clara swallowed, suddenly aware of how quiet it was again. Too quiet. She turned slowly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the details she hadn't noticed before. The careful placement of things, the way nothing felt random, the way everything seemed intentional. A strange thought crossed her mind. What if this wasn't just where Walter lived? What if this place had been prepared? For who, she didn't know. But the idea settled into her chest, heavy and undeniable. She moved back into the living room and crouched in front of the fireplace. There was a small stack of neatly cut wood beside it. Dry. Ready. Not forgotten. Ready? Clara hesitated only a second before reaching for it. It took her a few tries. The kindling didn't catch right away, and her hands felt clumsy, out of practice. But eventually, a small flame sparked, then grew, then spread. The fire came to life slowly, crackling softly as it took hold. Warmth began to push back against the cold, and with it, something else shifted. The shadows along the walls flickered, stretching and pulling in ways that made the room feel less empty, less still. Clara sat back on her heels, staring into the flames. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like she was intruding. She felt noticed, not in a frightening way, just acknowledged, as if the house had been waiting for someone to light the fire again, waiting for someone to step back into whatever this place used to be. Clara pulled a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders, settling closer to the hearth. The warmth seeped into her slowly, chasing away the cold that had followed her all day. She told herself it was just a house, just wood and stone and memory. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true, because something about this place didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of a question she hadn't asked yet. And somehow, she already knew she wasn't leaving as soon as she planned. Clara didn't know what woke her. It wasn't loud, not exactly. The fire had burned low, leaving behind a soft orange glow that barely reached the corners of the room. Shadows stretched long across the floor, slow and unmoving. The wind outside had quieted, and the cabin had settled into that deep, breathing silence only old places seem to know. But something had shifted. She sat up slowly on the couch, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her heart already beating a little faster than it should have been. Then she heard it again. A faint sound. Not a bang, not a crack. A creak. Soft, rhythmic, like wood shifting under weight. It was coming from the kitchen. Clara held her breath, listened. The sound came once more, then stopped. Nothing? For a moment, she told herself to lie back down. Old houses made noise. Pipes, wood, wind had all settled, expanded, contracted. It didn't mean anything. But something about this felt deliberate. She swung her feet to the floor. The wood was cold beneath her socks. Just the house, she whispered, though her voice didn't sound convinced. Step by step. She moved toward the kitchen, guided only by the dim glow of the dying fire behind her. When she reached the doorway, she paused. The room looked exactly the same. Still, quiet, empty. And yet, it wasn't. Her eyes moved slowly across the floor, scanning without knowing what she was looking for. Then she saw it. Near the far corner, where the linoleum curled slightly with age, one section of the floor didn't sit quite right. A board just slightly raised at the edge. Clara frowned and stepped closer. kneeling down. She brushed her fingers along the seam, pushing aside a thin layer of dust. Her fingertips caught on something cold. Metal. She cleared more of the dust away and revealed a small iron ring embedded into the wood. A handle. Her stomach tightened. There was no reason to feel that sudden, quiet wave of unease, but it came anyway, slow and heavy, like the air itself had changed. She hesitated. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, almost without deciding to, she reached out and wrapped her fingers around the ring. It was colder than she expected. She pulled. The wood groaned in protest, lifting slowly, revealing a dark square opening beneath. A draft of cold air rose up immediately, sharper than anything upstairs. It carried the scent of damp earth, old wood, and something else, something aged, something forgotten. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching slightly as she peered down into the darkness. Stairs. Narrow, steep, wooden steps disappearing into shadow. Her pulse quickened. A basement, she murmured. But no, this didn't feel like a normal basement. There was something about the way it was hidden, the way the air moved, the way the space below seemed held back, like it wasn't meant to be found easily. Clara stood, backing away for a second as if to give herself space to think. She didn't have to go down there. She could close it, go back to the couch, wait for morning. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. But reason had already begun slipping its grip on her the moment she stepped into this house. And now there was something else pulling at her. Not fear. Something quieter, stronger. Curiosity mixed with a strange sense of recognition. Like this place already knew her. Clara grabbed her flashlight from her bag and returned to the opening. She clicked it on and pointed it downward. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough wooden steps and stone walls below. She swallowed. Then, slowly, carefully, she placed one foot onto the first step. It creaked under her weight. She paused, waited. Nothing. Another step. And another. Each one echoing softly as she descended deeper, the light trembling slightly in her hand, her shadow stretched along the walls, flickering with every movement. The air grew colder, heavier. By the time her feet touched the ground, her breath had become visible again, rising in soft clouds in front of her. The room was small, low ceiling, stone walls darkened with age, and in the center of it, a cot. Simple, metal frame, a thin, worn mattress, a folded blanket at the foot. Next to it, a small wooden table. And on that table, a stack of notebooks. Clara stepped forward slowly, her heartbeat loud in her ears now. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the top one before finally touching it. The leather cover was cracked with age. She lifted it gently. The first page opened with a soft, dry whisper. The handwriting inside was steady, careful. At the top of the page, a name was written. Edwin Whitmore, winter 1934. Clara frowned slightly. Whitmore? Her family name. She read the first line and felt the air leave her lungs. Two tonight, a woman and her son, half frozen, couldn't turn them away. Clara froze. Her eyes moved to the next line. Then the next, each entry short, direct, quietly heavy. Sheriff came by again. Kept the fire low. They slept until dawn. Another one tonight, no name given. Her hands began to tremble. This wasn't a cellar. This wasn't storage. This was something else entirely. Clara looked around the small room again, at the cot, the blanket, the narrow walls that felt like they were holding more than just space. And slowly, painfully, the truth began to settle in. This place hadn't been built to keep things. It had been built to hide people. Clara didn't realize how long she had been standing there. The cold had settled into her bones, her fingers still resting on the open page, her breath shallow, uneven. The words in front of her blurred for a moment, not because she couldn't read them, but because something inside her was shifting too fast to keep up. She closed the notebook slowly. The sound, soft, dry, echoed louder than it should have in that small stone room. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the stack of journals on the table. Dozens of them. Years, maybe decades, of quiet entries. Of people. Of nights no one ever spoke about. Her uncle had never said a word about any of this. Not once. Not in the rare phone calls they used to have. Not in the brief, awkward visits before everything fell apart between them. Nothing. And yet, he had lived right above it. Clara let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to make sense of something that refused to be explained. All this time, she whispered. Her voice sounded small down here. She picked up another notebook, flipping it open at random, different handwriting this time, older, more careful. The ink faded but still readable. Different dates, different years. Same pattern. 3 tonight, 1 coughing bad. Kept them hidden, lights out early. They left before sunrise, didn't ask where they were going. Clara's throat tightened. These weren't just notes. They were records, not of events, of choices. Every line carried the same quiet weight. Someone had shown up, and someone had decided not to turn them away. Again, and again, and again. She looked around the cellar, really seeing it now. The cot wasn't just a bed. It was a place someone had survived the night. The blanket wasn't just cloth. It had held people who had nowhere else to go. The walls, they had listened. Clara swallowed hard, her chest tightening in a way that felt almost painful. Because suddenly, this wasn't about strangers anymore. This was about her family, her blood. The same people she had spent years quietly resenting. The same people she believed had chosen distance over love. Her uncle hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been protecting something, carrying something, alone. Clara pressed her lips together, her eyes stinging now, though she fought it at first. No, she murmured under her breath, almost shaking her head again. He could have told me. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Would she have listened? Back then, when she was angry, when she had already decided who he was, would she have understood any of this? The answer sat heavy in her chest. No, she wouldn't have. Clara let out a breath that turned into something shakier than she expected. She set the notebook down carefully, as if it mattered how she handled it now. Because it did. Everything about this place mattered. That was the part she hadn't understood before. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a responsibility, passed down quietly. Without ceremony, without explanation, just continued. Her gaze drifted back to the first notebook, the one she had opened when she came down. She flipped it to the last few pages. The handwriting grew slightly less steady toward the end, but still firm, still deliberate. And then, there it was, a single line written darker than the rest, as if the pen had pressed harder into the page. If you find this, don't let the fire go out. Clara's breath caught. For a second, the room seemed to shrink around her. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that made everything feel focused, intentional. Like that line had been waiting, not for just anyone. For her. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the page. Why me? She whispered. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even confusion. It was something closer to fear, not of the house, not of what she had found, but of what it meant. Because if this had been left for her, then it wasn't just a discovery, it was a choice. And choices like this, they change things. Clara closed the notebook again, slower this time. More carefully. She stood there for another moment, the silence pressing in, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of everything that had happened here, everything that had been kept quiet, everything that had mattered, even when no one was there to witness it. She turned toward the stairs, her legs feeling slightly unsteady as she began to climb back up. Each step creaked beneath her, louder now, echoing behind her like a reminder that she couldn't unknow what she had just learned. When she pushed the floorboard back into place and stood in the kitchen again, the air felt different. The same room, same walls, same table, same note on the wall, but she wasn't the same person standing in it anymore. Clara walked slowly back into the living room, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. She knelt in front of it without thinking, reaching for another piece of wood and placing it carefully onto the coals. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a small flame caught, flickered, and began to grow. Clara sat back, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as she watched it come back to life. Her eyes filled before she could stop it this time. Not from sadness, not entirely, but from the weight of the understanding finally settling into place. Her uncle hadn't left her a house. He had left her a purpose. And for the first time since arriving, Clara wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. The next morning came quietly. No dramatic sunrise, no sudden clarity. Just a soft gray light slipping through the windows, and the faint crackle of a fire that hadn't quite gone out. Clara was already awake. She hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two at most. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cellar again, the journals, the words. Don't let the fire go out. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of hot water. Not tea, she hadn't found any yet, just something warm to hold on to. The house felt different now. Not quieter, but aware, like it had shifted the moment she understood what it really was. Clara stood slowly and pulled on her coat her uncle's old flannel-lined jacket she had found hanging by the door. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and something familiar she couldn't quite name. Outside, the world was still buried in snow. The storm had passed, leaving everything untouched and painfully still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under her weight. Her breath rose in soft clouds as she looked out across the land, the fence line barely visible, the trees standing tall and silent beyond it. "This is yours now," she whispered. But the words didn't land the way she expected, because it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like responsibility. Clara stayed out there for a long moment before heading back inside. There was work to do, not because anyone told her to, but because something inside her had already decided she wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not at all. The first thing she did was clean. Not the kind of cleaning you do before selling a place. This was slower, more deliberate. She uncovered furniture, wiped down surfaces, opened windows just enough to let the stale air breathe. Every movement felt like she was waking the house up piece by piece. By midday, she had a small pile of trash near the door, a stack of usable firewood inside, and the fire burning stronger than the night before. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, she decided to drive into town. Ashgrove Ridge was smaller than she expected. A handful of buildings clustered along a single road, a general store, a gas pump, a church, and not much else. When she stepped into the store, a small bell rang above the door. The warmth hit her first, then the smell coffee, old wood, something baking in the back. A man stood behind the counter, older, gray beard, eyes sharp but not unkind. He looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You made it up to Whitmore Place," he said, like it wasn't a question. Clara blinked slightly. "I guess I did." He nodded once, like that confirmed something. "Storm didn't take you out. That's a good sign." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she just gave a small nod. "I'm Clara," she said after a moment. "Walter was my uncle." The man's eyes softened just a little. "Figured," he said. "Name's Thomas." He reached under the counter and set a small paper bag in front of her. "Nails, matches, couple things you'll need." Clara frowned. "I didn't." "On the house," he said simply. She hesitated. "Why?" Thomas leaned back slightly, studying her in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. "Because," he said slowly, "that house doesn't belong to just anyone." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Before she could ask what he meant, he added, "If you're staying, you'll understand soon enough." She did understand, sooner than she expected. It happened 2 nights later. The wind had picked up again, rattling the windows, pushing snow against the sides of the house. Clara sat by the fire, one of the old journals open in her lap, trying to make sense of it all. That's when she heard it. A knock? Sharp, sudden. Not imagined, not the house settling. A real knock. Clara froze. Her heart jumped hard against her ribs. No one should have been out there, not in this weather, not this late. The knock came again. 3 times. Clara stood slowly, the journal slipping from her lap onto the floor. Her mind raced every logical thought telling her to be careful, every instinct pulling her toward the door. She walked across the room, each step heavier than the last. Her hand hovered over the handle, and for a split second, she thought about the cellar, the journals, the words written over and over again by people who came before her. Couldn't turn them away. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened the door. A young man stood there, barely more than a boy, maybe 19, maybe younger. His jacket was soaked through, his face pale, lips trembling from the cold. Snow clung to his hair, his shoulders. He looked at her like he didn't expect the door to open at all. "Please," he said, voice cracking, I need somewhere warm." Clara didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, everything became simple. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said softly. The fire behind her crackled, warm and steady. And just like that, the legacy didn't belong to the past anymore. It was happening again, right here, through her. Clara didn't ask the boy any questions that night. Not where he came from, not what he was running from, not why his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the mug she gave him. Somehow, she already understood that it didn't matter. "Sit," she said gently, pulling a chair closer to the fire. He hesitated for a second, like he wasn't used to being told something without a catch behind it. Then he nodded and lowered himself down, his shoulders tight, eyes still darting around the room. Clara moved quietly through the kitchen. She found a can of soup in one of the cupboards, old, but still sealed, and warmed it on the stove. The simple act felt unfamiliar at first, and yet strangely natural, like her hands remembered something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. When she brought the bowl to him, he looked up at her, surprised. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. Clara just nodded. "Eat," she replied. He didn't need to be told twice. She sat back near the fire, watching the flames instead of him, giving him the space to feel safe. That was the word, wasn't it? Safe. She hadn't thought about it in years. The next morning, he was gone. Clara woke to the quiet hum of the house and the fading warmth of the fire. For a brief second, she wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. But then she saw it. A small piece of wood placed carefully on the table. Carved into it, uneven but clear. "Thank you." Clara picked it up slowly, running her fingers over the rough edges of the letters. Her chest tightened. Not with sadness, with something else. Something fuller. Days passed, then more days. And something began to change, not all at once, but in small, steady ways. Clara found herself waking earlier, moving with purpose. The heaviness she used to carry in her chest every morning, it wasn't gone, but it was lighter, manageable. She worked on the house during the day, fixing what she could, learning what she didn't know. At first, it was frustrating. Her hands slipped, nails bent. Wood didn't cut straight. She cursed more than once under her breath. But then something shifted. Her hands steadied. Her movements grew more confident. Blisters formed, then hardened into calluses. And with each small repair, each fixed hinge, each sealed crack, the house seemed to stand a little stronger. So did she. A man named Daniel started coming by twice a week. He didn't talk much at first, just showed up in an old pickup truck, tools in the back, eyes scanning the house like he was reading it. "Roof needs work," he said the first day, before the next storm. Clara nodded. Then we should start there. He glanced at her, just briefly, like he was measuring something. Then he gave a small nod of his own. They worked side by side. No small talk, no unnecessary words. Just the sound of hammer against wood, wind against the walls, and time moving forward in a way Clara hadn't felt in years. Over time, Daniel spoke more. Little things. Stories about the town, about winters that were worse than this one, about people who used to pass through these mountains and never quite made it where they thought they were going. "You're doing something important here," he said one afternoon, not looking at her as he adjusted a beam. Clara paused. "I'm just fixing a house." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "you're not." He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. The knocks came again. Not every night. Not even every week. But they came. A woman once quiet, her eyes tired in a way Clara recognized immediately. An older couple stranded after their car broke down miles from town. A man who didn't say a single word the entire time he was there, but left a folded blanket behind when he left. Clara didn't question it anymore. She didn't hesitate. Each time she opened the door. Each time she made space. Soup, fire, a place to sit, a place to breathe. That was enough. It had always been enough. One night, after the house had gone quiet again, Clara sat alone by the fire, one of the old journals open beside her. But she wasn't reading it. Not really. She was thinking about the woman she had been just weeks ago. The one who drove up here counting the days until she could leave. The one who believed she had nothing left to give. Clara let out a slow breath, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I was wrong," she murmured softly. Not about the house. Not about her uncle. About herself. She had spent years believing she was empty, that whatever warmth she once had burned out a long time ago. But sitting there now, with the fire crackling steadily in front of her, she realized something. It hadn't burned out. It had just been waiting. Waiting for a reason. Waiting for a place where it mattered. Clara reached forward, adjusting a piece of wood in the fire. The flames responded instantly, rising higher, stronger. She watched them for a long moment. Then, almost without thinking, she spoke again. "I won't let it go out." The words were quiet, but they carried weight now, because for the first time, she meant them. Winter didn't end all at once. It never does in places like Ashgrove Ridge. It softened, slowly, quietly, like the world was remembering how to breathe again. The snow began to loosen its grip on the land, melting just enough to reveal patches of earth beneath. The trees, once heavy with ice, stood lighter now, and in the early mornings, if you listened closely, you could hear water moving again somewhere beneath it all. Clara noticed it in small ways. The way the sunlight lingered a little longer through the windows. The way the air didn't bite quite as sharply when she stepped outside. The way the house felt alive. Not just warm, alive. The fire never went out anymore. Not completely. Even when it burned low in the middle of the night, Clara would wake without knowing why, walk quietly into the living room, and add another log. At first, she thought it was habit. Then she realized it was something deeper than that. Something that had been passed down long before her. Her days found a rhythm. Mornings started with wood and water, checking the stove, walking the fence line, letting the cold air wake her up properly. Afternoons were for fixing, cleaning, learning. Daniel still came by when he could, though less often now. The house didn't need as much saving as it once had. Evenings. Evenings were for the fire. And sometimes, for people. They still came, not in crowds, not in ways that could be explained or predicted. Just when they needed to. A woman who stayed 3 nights and cried only once quietly, when she thought no one could hear her. A man who fixed a broken hinge before he left, without saying a word. A young girl who asked Clara if the house was magic. Clara had smiled softly at that. "No," she said. But later that night, sitting alone by the fire, she wasn't so sure anymore. One evening, just as the sky turned that soft shade of blue that comes right before darkness, Clara stood on the porch, her coat pulled tight around her. The valley stretched out in front of her, quiet, wide, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. Behind her, through the window, she could see the firelight flickering against the walls. Warm, steady, waiting. She took a slow breath, letting it fill her chest fully. There had been a time not that long ago when silence like this would have felt unbearable. Too empty. Too loud in its own way. But now, it felt different. Full. Not of noise, but of meaning. The knock came just as the last light began to fade. Clara didn't startle this time. She didn't hesitate. She simply turned, walked back inside, and crossed the room at an even pace. Her hand rested on the door handle for only a second. Then she opened it. A woman stood there. Older, maybe in her 60s. her coat thin against the cold, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. But it wasn't the cold that made Clara freeze. It was her face. Familiar, painfully familiar. "Clara," the woman said, her voice unsteady. Clara felt her breath catch. "Margaret." Her aunt gave a small, broken nod. For a moment, neither of them moved. Years of silence stood between them. Years of things unsaid, regret, distance, hurt that had never quite found the right words. Clara's chest tightened, old emotions rising fast, confusion, anger, grief, all of it rushing back in ways she hadn't expected. This was different from the others. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who had been part of her life, and then wasn't. Someone she had let go. Or maybe someone she had pushed away. Margaret's voice trembled again. "I didn't know where else to go." Simple words, but they carried everything. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at the lines on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet vulnerability she wasn't trying to hide. And in that moment, Clara understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. The people who showed up at her door, they weren't just cold. They weren't just lost. They were carrying pieces of their lives that had nowhere else to land. Just like she had been all those years ago. Clara stepped aside. The movement was small, but it meant everything. "Come in," she said softly. Margaret hesitated only a second, then stepped inside. The warmth wrapped around her immediately. The fire crackled gently behind them. Clara closed the door. And just like that, something that had been broken for years started to mend. Later that night, they sat together by the fire, not talking much, not needing to, just sharing the same space, the same warmth. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara didn't feel like something was missing. She looked at the flames, steady and bright, and let out a quiet breath. "I understand now," she whispered. Not to her aunt, not to the house, but to the part of herself that had been searching all along. Because this place, it had never been about hiding. It had never been about escape. It had always been about one simple, stubborn truth. No one should have to face the cold alone. And as the fire burned steadily into the night, Clara knew one thing for certain. It never would. Not as long as she was there. Sometimes, what we inherit isn't money or property. It's a choice. A choice to stay closed off, or to open our hearts, even after everything we've been through. Clara couldn't change her past, but she chose not to let it make her cold. Instead, she turned it into warmth for others. And that's the truth. You don't have to be perfect to help someone. You just have to be willing to open the door. Your fire can be something simple, a kind word, a phone call, or just being there when someone needs you. Small things can change someone's life. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need it. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one open door.